Belongs Mental Health Collective primarily aims to build a platform that can cater customized mental health services to people who face identity-based discrimination. And going forward, we are looking at having one-on-one therapy sessions, group workshops, and several other models of how to go about this. For today's event, which is going to talk about mental health and inclusive mental health, we have a panel of guests, and I'm just going to give brief introductions to them, and I'll just let the guests speak about their work in a line or two after I take their name. First, we'll start with Hena, who's a therapist at the Nunn Institute in New Delhi. Hena, on to you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm a trauma-focused psychotherapist working here at the Nunn Institute unit in Delhi, and my interest is in creating an inclusive, socially inclusive and just society, and how do we design better communities around that.
Professor of Law at NALSAR University in Hyderabad. Amita, if you could speak about your work.
Well, I teach at a law school, and I have researched extensively in the whole area of mental health and law, and especially with the fact that how law becomes an instrument of discrimination in itself. And somewhere it's important for us to be looking at the whole issue of mental health outside the medical paradigm, and more to do with, the sort of things that we do on an everyday basis and the manner in which we organize our society as a whole. Where is it that we factor in questions of mental
health? Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for being here today. We have Astha Ahluwalia, who's the Chief Psychologist and Partner at Reboot Wellness. Astha, if you can speak a couple of words about, a couple of sentences about what you do.
Hi, Lasya. Thank you for having me here. My name is Astha Ahluwalia. And as Lasya mentioned, I'm the Chief Psychologist and Therapist at Reboot Wellness. We're an all-encompassing organization and a mental health service provider. We're a team of psychologists, counselors, and psychiatrists working towards spreading awareness about mental health and at the same time providing one-on-one and group services. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to look forward to how the conversation is going to be.
Thank you so much, Astha. Then we also have Rashi Sinha, who's the who's the core team member at Mindpiper. Rashi?
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Rashi and I work with Mindpiper. We are a Delhi-based impact-first mental health organization, and our journey started around 3 years back, and it started in Daryaganj, but now we are doing a lot more. And I really look forward to uncovering a lot more with my panelists about inclusive mental health today.
Thank you so much, Rashi. Thanks for being here today. We have Arpita Gupta, who's a clinical psychologist researching lived experiences of severe mental health illnesses at IIT Kanpur.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lasya, for having me on board. I am a clinical psychologist with training and expertise in narrative practices, which basically highlights that in most of the situations, the problem is the problem and the person is not the problem, even in the context of mental illnesses. For the last 6 years, I have been researching the lived experiences of severe mental illness, which celebrates the subjective experiences and the personal know-hows that people have about when they are living with a severe mental illness, like a schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, as opposed to the expertise that the biomedical model is sort of providing. So I hope to bring the lenses of loss and grieving into this conversation, and how these lenses sort of provide an alternate window into the experiences of people who face identity-based discrimination, as opposed to a lens of say depression or anxiety, which medicalizes the problem.
We have Christy Nag, who is a member of Blue Dawn, a network of support for Bahujans.
Johar everyone. So I work with Blue Dawn. It's a support group for people from Bahujan communities, and it started a year back Divya, our founder, she started this collective, and many other people joined hands. And um, so our major focus is how this, like, we specifically look at how mental health is connected with the structures prevalent in Indian continent, and then how communities have been working towards it. So yeah, I'll be talking a bit more on that.
We have Shambhavi, who's a writer at Youth Ki Awaaz.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for having me. I've been watching webinars since you guys have started, so it's so exciting to be actually like on the other side of the camera. So as last year mentioned, I work as a writer with Youth Ki Awaaz, and I specifically look at our LGBTQ vertical. Since 2015, what I've basically been doing is collecting stories from queer people across India and having them tell their own stories as opposed to speaking on their behalf. And I am also queer myself, and I will be speaking today from that lens as as one of the people who goes to you people. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Shambhavi, and thanks everybody for being here today. Just for the sake of our attendees, what we're going to do next is ask questions to everybody here on the panel about specific things that they specialize in, or how identity-based discrimination comes into play in the context of mental health. And after that, we will take a question. We'll take questions through the chat. So if you have any questions that crop up through the course of the webinar, you could leave questions, type the questions down on the chat window that you can see, and we'll curate it and ask the panelists.
Lastly, just a quick correction. Please type your questions on the Q&A box. Use the Q&A button, not the chat button.
Okay, so I'm so sorry about that. You have to chat. You have to type the questions on the Q&A button, and then we'll curate and ask the panelists who will answer it towards the end. All right. So just going to the first, I think the first few questions I think would be for Hena. Hena, if are you there? Yeah. So if you could just mute your, yeah. So the question would be, can you mention a few of the unique barriers people from religious minority groups experiencing mental health problems encounter when seeking care? And also, what reforms would you suggest for the mental health services to take in view of providing a truly inclusive space for people from religious minorities while seeking therapy?
I think we've all been really aware about how, we've all heard stories from across different metros, like in fact in India, about stories about people from minority religions not being given housing or being asked to pay extra rent, sometimes being removed from housing without, without the usual notice periods being covered and things like that. And so there's always, to be fair, there's always been these stories that have been floating around for quite a while. And this is definitely an issue that, this kind of discrimination based on religious identity tends to also come out in different other ways, like even being able to access mental health services. We have, there are many instances of people coming from minority religions who may feel that therapists may not have insight about what it means to come from a particular community or particular background. I think it's important for therapists to have cultural humility, right? Which is an idea that all cultures have particular ways in which they deal with things, and how do we address the issues at hand in a humble way as possible. Understanding that even though our differences, even though we may be culturally different, there are things that we can still learn from each other. So there are those kind of ideas as well that kind of operate in these particular aspects. It's very often you'll see, I've had clients come in who, especially in the current socio-political scenario of recent times, about how things have become harder to deal with. Some people have found themselves at the end of Islamophobic comments. Other minorities also facing a lot of issues in terms of how they're being perceived as stereotypical of particular sections of their communities, and how there's a form of assumption that, oh, you must, all of you are alike, and then the fear of what we call stereotype threat, because everyone, like, nobody wants to be the stereotype when it's negative, and how do you deal with that? So there's been a lot of concerns in that way coming up.
Drawing from what you just said,
Mm-hmm.
do you also notice that when people from, say, certain religious minorities try to access therapy, do they
Mm-hmm.
themselves, as a precautionary measure, if I may use that word, prefer to go to a therapist who is from the same cultural background? Do you see that happening?
It sometimes goes, I will tell you this, it sometimes goes two ways. Sometimes there's the assumption that if I go to somebody who matches my cultural background, I may be expected to toe certain lines of tradition and like culture, rituals, like even ethnic cultural traditions, and which may not be in line with what the person wants to do. So there's a fear of, oh, if I go to somebody who's from my exact background, will they judge me? That's there on one hand. But on the other end, there is also the issue of, is this like, okay, this person may not match my cultural background, but can they accept where I come from? Will I find acceptance for my identity, right? For where I come from the religious and the ethnic traditions that I carry with me as part of my, generational. I was going to use the word generational trauma, but also just the things that kind of form part of my identity. But can I find acceptance for that? And so it's honestly, it is both these issues on both sides. There is, if this person is from my background, will I be expected to toe the line? And then if this person isn't from that, can they understand where I'm coming from? Will they understand who I am and what it means to me, what my religious identity means to me, and what it means for me to be part of this community? I don't want to blanket statement it and say that either only one of the two happens. Both of these things are very real issues. They're very real concerns that we see coming up.
All right. So this could then count as one of those things that could come out of the fear of the discrimination that or improper access that people feel they might face while they come from these identities.
Very often, like I've heard statements of the sort that, oh, they wouldn't understand. Like if I try to explain to them, I don't think they would understand. So I don't know that I can go and approach, mental health care, because I don't know if they'll understand where I'm coming from. Like, will I be seen as only that?
All right.
Or can I be seen as more?
All right. Okay. That's actually a very insightful beginning, I think. Thanks, Hena. We'll come back to you. The next question would be to Arpita. Arpita, your research is centered mainly around mental health and loss, like you mentioned earlier. How would you fit loss into the larger spectrum of identity-based discrimination?
I'm doing my research in the context of loss, and when anybody thinks about loss, the predominant image that comes to our mind is of death, or loss in context of you having a breakup or something like that, losing another person. And so which loss, what it does is it signifies that how in the context of a self, the other is very important. And the same is applicable to identity. When you're talking about our own identities, and there's a plethora of identities that we might identify, any one person can identify with. Every identity is in the context of another. Like, how am I being perceived? Am I being accepted? Is what I'm doing okay? And all these answers, any answer to all these questions come from another. And so does the discrimination. So in the context of discrimination basically emerges from differences that are seen between me and the other. And when those differences become a cause for distress, that's when it leads to a reduction in resource of a person. whether it's a personal resource of a friend or relationships or opportunities, and that's where loss fits in. With any kind of identities, I've majorly worked with illness identities, people who have severe mental illnesses, and those are chronic identities that people live with. And there's a lot of discrimination and stigma that this population lives with on a day-to-day basis, along with a lot of losses of opportunities, relationships, social loss of dignity and credibility. But more in at another level is also loss at a structural level, where like for instance, Hena was talking about the concern of how when a person approaches a therapist, they have even if not a therapist, in their day-to-day living, this concern that whether I'd be understood or not, whether I'd be accepted or not. This concern, this worry sometimes can be so exacerbated that it might be clinically diagnosed as anxiety. The sadness that you're not accepted, you do not have the opportunities or the trajectory of life that you had envisioned for yourself is not getting fulfilled because of the identity that you have, or you're not being able to be your authentic true self because of the kind of feedback that you're getting from the environment. That can get diagnosed as depression. And we're talking about the intersection of identity-based discrimination and the mental health consequences. When we view things from a lens of loss, a lot of these concerns, a lot of these worries, a lot of this sadness, distress need not really be medicalized. It's a loss that is happening at an individual level, at a personal, interpersonal, and structural level. And everyone is responding, every individual is responding. They have a certain know-how of negotiating around it, given they get the right kind of support. And anytime a person has a concern while they're going to a therapist, whether they'd be understood or not, is a legit concern. Because their past experiences, their personal history, as well as their collective history, has given them enough evidence to know that they might be misunderstood. And there is a need to create spaces where people can have those safe spaces, where these concerns can be, engaged with in the right kind of manner.
All right. Okay. That brings me to, since that was a very good explanation, that brings me to the next level of a maybe slightly structural question. So how can you maybe reconceptualize grieving and loss due to identity? How can you maybe reconceptualize mental health concepts of grieving and loss in the context of identity-based discrimination?
So when I say grieving, a lot of times in response to any kind of identity-based discrimination, there's a reaction by a person, right? And it can be anger, it can be sadness, it can be anxiety, it can be a lot of emotional things, right? But all of that emotions come from a place of something that is meaningful for that person. So when I say grieving, there is an emotional connotation to grief. But there's also a very cognitive, meaning-oriented connotation to grief, where a person engages in a meaning-making effort. So any kind of discrimination that happens, a person creates a meaning around it. If the person is able to create a positive meaning around it, right, through either by their own selves or through support, through therapeutic support, through interpersonal support, whichever way it is. That meaning-making process is what I'm calling grieving, where your world is reaffirmed. It's reconceptualized in a way that helps you move forward. It helps you grow as a person in the face of existing discrimination at various levels in your environment.
Thank you so much for that, Arpita. We will get back to you with next in a bit. Next question, I think, is to Astha. Astha, if you can just unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So after the first, I think to move a little more quickly, I'd maybe slowly ask you a couple of questions together going forward.
Sure.
So since you've worked a lot at the intersection of, say, marginalized communities and LGBT, etc., such as LGBT, the questions maybe are slightly more specific to the community. The question is, what are some of the mental health challenges that people from communities such as LGBTQIA plus face differently? And also, what are the different techniques or methods through which one addresses or works towards the emotional well-being of people from underserved communities through therapy?
Okay, great. So, before I go ahead, I've read it in a lot of reports that people who come from, marginalized sections, and especially those from the LGBT, QI community, they have 3 times more chances of experiencing a mental health concern than a person who identifies to be straight, right? And the reasons for this is the attitude that they are faced with. The reason for this is the discrimination that they have to endure and experience. There is bullying as well in a lot of cases, in most cases than not. There is also isolation, and I think the core of it lies in the lack of acceptance. So when a lot of these people, I also feel that a lot of these people don't, there is not so much of, because of the whole narrative around mental health, and then the whole narrative around being marginalized and the discrimination that one faces. A lot of individuals don't really come out and seek therapy that openly. But from those that who do, some of the common concerns that I've seen is the first and the core of it lies in acceptance. There is no acceptance from the first step is to accept your own self for who you are. And I often see a lot of these, a lot of individuals struggling with the dissonance between who am I, where do I belong, where do I fit in. I want to be accepted and validated by people around me, but I also want to do that on my own terms, which may not be in sync with what my society, the cues that my society gives me to be. So that is one major conflict that that I've seen in specifically in individuals who identify as LGBTQ. um, and that the other is the whole debate about, do I stay in the closet, do I come out, how much do I express myself, how much will that be accepted. Now this puts a lot of psychological pressure on any human being, when you're denied from your external environment to be who you are. And it's something like, it's something like, and I was sort of referring this to another colleague of mine, that right now, because we are all on lockdown, we are also restricted and refrained to actually be our complete selves. There's so much of restraint. And it's very similar to, and I mean, much more profound in cases of individuals who can't or who struggle with expressing themselves uh, just because they know that they will not get validation. So that's another major struggle or challenge that people face. It is the pressure of conformity, which puts a lot of emotional burden. It creates a lot of stress, anxiety. There are a lot of comorbid conditions that we also see. So depression, anxiety, stress is the common other common things. There are suicidal ideations, even attempts. There is self-harm. These are some of the things that we see very, very commonly, and also addictions. So we see a lot of youth specifically when because they're dabbling with so much of confusion and conflict around who they are, who they want to be, how much acceptance that that they will get, that they get, a lot of them get stuck in the addiction cycle. There is also a lot of lack of trust. Most of the clients that I've had and I've worked with, I have displayed serious concerns about trusting other people, because there's such a vacuum of disapproval that they face regularly. And also the whole concept of safety. I don't think a lot of them feel safe. Now, safety is not, there is physical, I mean, for a lot of them, physical safety is a question because bullying is involved. And we're talking, I mean, and there is a marked difference that we see when we talk about, the urban population and the rural population, because in the urban India, and there are two Indias that we live in the urban India, there's more acceptance coming in year after year. And, however, when we talk about the rural part of our country, there is, I've heard of things like there is going to be corrective intercourse just to prove that you identify as a straight individual, and things like that. So there is a lot of emotional pressure that is put upon, and there is also something known as gender dysphoria, which is essentially having identity issues with one's sexuality and one's gender conformity. That puts an impact on the way we think, the way we feel, the way we act, on also the way we fantasize about our sexuality, etc., etc. So these are some of the common challenges that that I have seen a lot of people face, and I'm sure there are plenty more. The problem is that we focus only on identifying them as depressed or anxious or suicidal, or etc., etc. So those diagnoses are not very helpful. Now I'll try and answer the second part of your question, which is what is it that can be done. And I think one of the most important things that need to be done is to create a lot of awareness and to have avenues open for people to actually get help. That is step number one. There aren't there aren't a lot of people who access these services because they feel that they will not be accepted. And I'm going to borrow from what Hena had said earlier, that there is the reason why they don't come is because the question they think that they won't be understood. So as a therapist, and I try and say this as much as I can, it is very important for the therapist to be aware. It is the first step is for the therapist to be self-reflective and aware of their own biases, their own conditioning, their own thought processes, their own attitudes before you attempt to work with anybody from any marginalized section. We've all, as as psychologists and therapists, we've all read about concepts of empathy and unconditional positive regard and all of that, but that only comes into play when you question your own self. So that is step one, to be aware and to make other mental health professionals also aware of what does it mean, what I mean, we don't even know the clinical definitions. Most of the people don't know the clinical definitions, or what or what it essentially means. And then I think the essence also of therapy lies in building rapport, in creating that safe space, and also helping individuals identify that there is a difference between feeling safe and seeking validation. The first step would be to have and create a safety net. And there's a form of therapy that is extensively used for specifically for individuals that identify as LGBTQ, and that is called the affirmative therapy. It's essentially a psychosocial model which relies on not only tapping onto the psychological concerns or the processes of the individual, but also helping the individual develop and build on social resources. Because though they need to deal with their discrimination and they need to deal with the emotions around it, there has to be a safety net to facilitate that process. Helping them identify communities that they can that they can belong themselves to. And these days, I mean, I keep hearing I know Delhi University has a very, very functional community. Ashoka University has, and there are a lot of other educational institutes that are also becoming very, very aware and are creating communities for people to interact with and come together. So that is a lot. That is one. Then also creating an affirmative setting. And by affirmative setting, I mean using language that is appropriate, and it's okay if you don't know, you can ask, right? You can ask a person, how do I address you as? What do I address you as? And that is because therapy as a process only works when you work together, when the therapist and the client works together. So being on the same page, and also the commitment that a therapist would require, and educate yourself, ask questions when needed, get involved, and help address the psychological as well as the social needs of the individual, along with dealing with the anxiety, the depression, the mood concerns, the emotional concerns, etc., developing coping skills, managing mechanisms, etc. And at the same time building and focusing on strength. So for me, the approach that I think works the best is an affirmative strength based approach, where you are helping an individual identify where their strengths lie, so that they can move beyond and have a hope for a more like a future which is more fulfilling. So dealing and managing with the emotions and thoughts and feelings at one end, along with that creating a social secure network. It's important. Social safety is extremely important, especially when you constantly feel discriminated, and at the same time building on strengths and building on development and growth.
All right, that was extremely insightful, Astha.
Thank
I
you.
just have I have a small follow-up question, if you could just address it
Sure.
shortly. Since you used words such as social safety and trust, and we are speaking something like LGBTQ, at least talking about it from an urban Indian context or a metro context, or talking about it in bigger cities like Delhi or Mumbai, would you think that the more the awareness grows around it, or due to changes in law, it's become maybe people who seek therapy are more open about expressing themselves now over the past few years?
Oh, most definitely. I think there has been a shift, because with acceptance comes, you feel more strengthened and empowered to actually take that step and seek therapy. And see, essentially, I think what the awareness has done is that it has given people a chance to believe that they also exist and their existence is equally important, as everyone else's. It's just it's a validation. It's created a space for people from, with varied sexualities or gender identities to come and say that yes, we're as human as you. And and now people are recognizing that as well. So of course there has been a shift. There are more and more number of people who are reaching out and and seeking help.
All right, okay, thank you so much, Astha. That was
Thank you.
We'll get back to you shortly.
Yeah.
Our next question is for Rashi. The questions to you would be, what has your experience been working with mental health of marginalized communities? Is there a unique challenge that stands out while addressing mental health and discrimination against the marginalized communities specifically? And also, if you could share any anecdotes or examples, obviously without revealing details, of how challenges could look like, building on to what Astha said.
All right. So for anybody who missed my introduction, my name is Rashi and I'm a psychotherapist. And आज हम जो टॉपिक के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं, I feel इसमें अगर लैंग्वेज का जिक्र नहीं हुआ तो ये अधूरा रह जाएगा. Talking about inclusion, sometimes the terms mental health and the term therapy itself serves to exclude. I mean, not only just because ये English में है, क्योंकि these are also heavy concepts in themselves. I mean, who defines what exactly therapy is? अगर एक बंद कमरे में 2 लोग बैठे हैं तो क्या ये थेरेपी है? अगर एक थेरेपिस्ट और कम से कम 30-40 लोग साथ में एक रूम में हैं, will it still be counted as therapeutic? So I feel apart from the conceptual understanding जो शायद हम deconstruct कर सकते हैं, we also at a basic level come up with simpler terms which are not only more understandable but बाकी लोग भी इसे रीच कर सकते हैं. So जिसने भी कभी भी mental health के हिंदी ट्रांसलेशन में मानसिक स्वास्थ्य बोला है, I think it's a very सावर्ण term. हम में से कोई नहीं कभी नहीं बोलता होगा कि मेरा आज मानसिक स्वास्थ्य खराब है. I think हम लोग बहुत ही आम भाषा में भी just say कि मन में कुछ प्रॉब्लम चल रही है, कुछ मुश्किल है, कुछ दिक्कतें आ रही हैं. So I think as an organization, Mind Piper, जिस संस्था से मैं जुड़ी हूँ, हम लोग यही काम कर रहे हैं. We are trying to make mental health accessible. So we are based in Delhi, and for over 3 years, we have been trying to create sustainable innovation in mental health at the margins. And आज मैं जिस project का थोड़ा सा जिक्र करना चाह रही हूँ, that is the coming together of Mind Piper and a non-profit called Center for Equity Studies. So CES has been leading the knowledge and expertise on urban homelessness, and they are running model interventions for recovery and care. So उनके 2 recovery shelters हैं दरियागंज के आसपास, and we have partnered, and for 1 year we have been engaging with their recovery shelters and trying to understand what would mental health with the urban homelessness, what would an intervention look like. So I feel जहाँ discrimination की बात आ रही है, these are people who have been economically marginalized, who are socially uprooted, and because of the traumatic incidences that they have faced, they have somehow reached in this situation, and they are finding themselves in the situation of being a homeless person on the streets. But एक तरह का जो नजरिया है, especially high to middle class का देखने का, there is a particular gaze towards people on the streets. एक लोग ऐसा मानते हैं कि ये ऐसा ही होना चाहते हैं, इनके अंदर कैपेबिलिटीज नहीं है, एडिक्शन से सबकी प्रॉब्लम है, or there is a lack of impulse control, but nobody is able to sort of understand that they're not able to come out of their circumstances. And I feel this perception is nazariye ki hi kafi discrimination hoti hai, jiske karan when policy elites also view something like homelessness from this understanding, I guess somewhere we fail to understand that there can also be a biopsychosocial care instead of a roti kapda makan model of care. क्योंकि जब रोटी कपड़ा मकान भी मिलता है, sometimes people use them and inadvertently come back to the situation because somewhere that identity repair work did not happen. Whatever they are facing, जो भी उनके एक तरह के physical और emotional challenges हैं, उन पे बात नहीं होती. So we have been experimenting and we have been running some interventions. We call Mazbooty sessions, जहाँ पे हम हर महीने कुछ sessions करते हैं यहाँ पे shelter members के साथ. And I feel the challenge here is more coming from the mental health field, like as an expert if I'm going there, because वहाँ जाके मेरी सारी approaches that I want, they are coming from such Western models that they drop. And I have found that काफी सारी चीज वहाँ पे जाके समझ में आती है कि इसे डिजाइन करना पड़ेगा. Like there has to be a lot of design thinking involved in coming up with these interventions, and I feel this is where a lot of challenges lie, whether we are able to get away from what we have learned as what is therapeutic, what is mental health, and how much are we able to contextualize, that being the right word, कि कितना हम अपने इन learnings को as an expert हमारे segment के साथ blend कर पा रहे हैं. So I feel over this past year that we have been working, we have been able to understand some of the gaps, and we have been able to positively impact more than 500 people. पर यही बात अगर identity की बात अगर मुझे उस ग्रुप के साथ करनी होती जिसके साथ मैं काम करती हूँ, बहुत ही अलग. I'll just give you an example how the first session typically goes. So पहचान की बात कर रहे हैं, so what we ask our members is that आगरा की पहचान क्या है? So people typically say what you have in mind, Taj Mahal. और then we ask कि अगर मानिए दिल्ली की पहचान क्या है? And then they say बहुत सारे फिर आंसर्स आते हैं, कभी जामा मस्जिद, कभी इंडिया गेट, कभी कुतुब मीनार. एंड कि अगर आगरा की अगर मैं आपको बोल रही हूँ कि ताजमहल एक दिन, फिर आगरा को कैसा लगेगा? And then I think they start talking about how when one major identity falls apart, nothing left. However, they're also to understand that Delhi will probably be okay because so एक ये बहुत ही छोटा सा example था कि how we have to sort of design these conversations, talk about what we are talking about using tools of language like metaphors, like symbols, folk symbols, ताकि हम इस भाषा में ही जो एक alienation छुपी हुई है उसे एक तरह से उससे break away कर पाएं. So that was just one small tool that I use back at the field. And what I feel that mental health at the margins is a rights-based conversation, because unless this is not weaved in the policy itself, unless people like बहुत सारे हमारे लोगों से बात होती है, like we talk to investors, we talk to different people in different forums, and I think one place where even I am looking out for help is how do we measure impact? Because a lot of the work जो अभी चल रहा है, जितने भी काम हम कर पा रहे हैं in partnership with CES, the immediate effects are very intangible. However, the long-term outcomes are undeniable. How do you sort of hold that space which is so much heavily influenced by impact, जहाँ पे आप usually इतने ऐसे gold standard programs run नहीं कर सकते? So I guess that is one critical challenge, and I feel by only through collaboration and only through partnership we can make mental health more of a rights-based conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rashi. I think it was mostly an awakening call for me. Sorry for speaking not with the language, but thank you for saying that, actually. And also, thank you for speaking about the customization. I think the Agra thing really got me goosebumps personally. It was the analogy or the anecdote. Um, uh, I will come back to you shortly. The next question is for Christy. So, what has your experience been addressing gender dysphoria with the therapists you approached? And how much of an instrumental role does addressing gender dysphoria properly play in the process of therapy? And if you're comfortable, could you share maybe the good or bad experiences you've had and how they look like without revealing details?
So yeah, for the like for people who've just for people joined later, Christy this side. I'm from Blue Dawn, and Blue Dawn is a mental health support group for individuals coming from Bahujan communities, like specifically ST, OBC communities. And yeah, so coming to the question right now. So okay. Before that, I'm not a mental health professional. I am a social worker, and the answer that I would be giving it would be majorly from social work perspective, from a social work lens, and from my personal experience working from my personal therapy experiences. Um, to begin with, I kind of strongly feel that there is a need for fundamental changes within the mental health discourse itself, because this entire discourse in itself is way too individualistic in nature, and it tries to locate the problem within the individual, whereas in many cases it is not. In many cases, it is also sociological and cultural in nature, and we need to locate, like we need to shift from a very individualistic approach um, to an approach that would have an understanding of sociological aspects, that would have an understanding of the cultural aspects as well. And that is something which is kind of strongly needed, specifically for people, like specifically for queer people and people from various Bahujan communities. Um, this is something that the mental health professionals here in the panel could add on more. In my experience, like what, okay, please do not take me wrong. It is just my personal experience that I'm sharing. So many times often that I've experienced through therapies, mental health professionals work with a tick mark thing. कि हाँ ठीक है ये चीज है. Now we have to locate the symptoms, and इसके साथ साथ इसको कोई ना कोई बॉक्स में तो अब डालना है. अब ये बॉक्स में डालने के बाद इसका एडजस्टमेंट करना पड़ेगा. And that is something which is problematic, because this entire DSM approach, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which most mental health professionals follow, is problematic in nature, because it defines what is normal, what is not normal in that way. And then if things are not normal, then they have to be adjusted and they have to be changed, which does not work, which does not cater to the sociological and structural issues of the problem. Just to explain this a bit more, I'll just use an example. For example, I'm not using my own life. It's kind of connected to my life. So when it comes to Adivasi children, said like literacy rate of tribal children of Adivasi is quite low. And जब भी उनकी पढ़ाई शिक्षा की बात होती है, it is said कि उनको पढ़ने का मन नहीं है, सरकार तो बहुत कुछ कर रही है. Free school is there, midday meal is there, teachers are there, but उनको पढ़ने का इच्छा ही नहीं है, तो बोल करके वो नहीं पढ़ाई कर रहे. But if you look into the entire education system, it is developed by Savarna. It is in a foreign language. It does not cater Adivasi children. My language is Mundari. I have never learned Mundari. I had to learn Hindi, then I had to learn English in my in mainstream education, which in itself alienates me. So, and then the kind of cultures and history we are reading in the in academia. We are not reading our own culture, history and cultures of other communities. So these are certain things which we need to look into when it comes to mental health as well. When we are talking of mental health concerns of people coming from specific communities, we need to address them, and we need to kind of in the therapy room find ways of validating those, validate their community wisdom as well. This is like just one example is, if you just keep suppose in a family counseling therapy, if books are just kept, and in those books it is those heteronormative families which is shown, and a queer person approaches that family, how would a queer person feel in that room then? Because I'm just a quote unquote man, a quote unquote woman, and with some maybe with one or two kids. And those are the pictures that is there, like in the put in the therapy room as quote as the ideal family. So how would a trans person, me sitting in that therapy room, would feel about that entire session, about that entire discourse? So we need to find ways of maybe like of decolonializing this entire setup, which is I guess Rashi pointed out this entire setup of this entire mental health discourse in many ways is colonial, is Western, and we need to find ways of decolonizing this entire discourse and this entire discourse mental. Again, the question asked with respect to gender dysphoria. Again, I would like to stress upon that gender dysphoria is not an individual's issue, it is a structural issue. So when we are addressing this issue, we need to address the structure that is involved in it. At certain levels, I do understand that therapists are not in a position to do much about the structure in place, but at the same time, if that structure is not addressed at all in the therapy, in the entire discourse, then how would I take it? Then the entire gender dysphoria becomes my problem. Then I become the problem. Then how do I deal with this entire I'm just stuck in a kind of spiral. It's just rotating within me. I cannot come out of it, but at the same time, the structure remains the same, and the structure is not getting addressed. So that structures need to be addressed within the therapy room. Structures of patriarchy, structures of caste, structures of indigeneity, that is in many ways is a huge role in the mental health of individuals.
Yes, that was actually extremely useful, I think. I'm not a therapist, but I completely understand what you're saying in that context, but not quite at the same time. But yeah, thank you for breaking it down to something so basic. It was very, very valuable. And I think quickly moving on to the next panelist, I think we are going to ask the next question to Shambhavi. Okay, so I'm going to ask your questions also as a stack. So the first one would be, have you needed to go to therapy to come to terms with your identity? Or did you discover that your identity played an integral role in addressing your mental health issues to begin with? The next part of that question is, what has your experience with therapists been like? Did you immediately find therapists who took identity as an important parameter in the process of therapy, and how did they navigate that?
All of these will be from personal perspective. So I honestly never thought that I would have to go to therapy, particularly for my identity, because I began identifying as queer quite early on, and then was able to narrow it down to one of the sub-identities on the acronym, which is asexual. And at the time, there were no resources. I hardly knew any other asexual people. That was slowly building up. And I think my coming out journey is also attached to sort of this swelling of the asexual community online. So it was extremely helpful. And I really got off on the right foot. Like I began by being very confident with myself. I began feeling relieved that, okay, I have this one word. there is somebody, even if they're like sitting in Chicago somewhere, somebody who knows what I'm going through. A year later, I find someone, in Bangalore who knows what it is. A year later, I find someone in Delhi who's in fact started up a collective of asexual people. So my, starting point in this entire journey was super positive. But eventually, the world started wearing me down. And it was completely unexpected for me because, I was one of those people who would like hoard these posts on like body positivity and queer positivity, and I would sort of like live off of that content. And then suddenly I started noticing that there were these jokes, sort of like excluding me and other queer people in very cis hetero spaces. Then within queer spaces, there started to be jokes about, oh, well, Shambhavi won't get this joke because she's, asexual and it doesn't make sense to her. Then there also started to be very suggestive remarks. I think someone on the panel had also talked about, these corrective procedures that in rural areas happening. I think Astha had mentioned that. And that started to become a problem. And for me, in fact, I had gone from saying asexuality is completely natural and I am proud of who I am, to eventually saying maybe I am broken, maybe there is something wrong. And it started to become a huge problem and it was hard to shake off. And I had lost that confidence that I had initially. So the first thing I thought was, I don't know if I should go for therapy because I don't know to what extent a therapist would be equipped to do the care work that was required for me and for my particular identity. So with that, I just want to, segue into the second question last year, which was my experience with therapists. I've had two so far. Both of them have been very, very young. Both of them have been assigned female at birth. I do believe they identify as cisgender. So luckily for me, the first therapist that I had was very aware of the spectrum and was willing to do the work in order to understand what LGBTQIA is and then do further work to understand what the A is, which I did not think anyone at the time was doing. And this was about 3 years ago. So for me, it was very helpful to see a therapist who had, gotten an idea of something during the first 2 or 3 sessions and then said, okay, next week I'm going to come back, I'm going to read up about this, and I'm going to help you. I did not think that I would find someone who would actually go and do that work, but it was the right kind of effort. The second therapist that I had, though, it was sort of like she was following an approach that did not see difference. Possibly in the same way that, some people say, I don't see caste or I don't see race, which, like it's well intentioned, but it was still a little bit ignorant, like she would bank on some very conventional ideas of what love and romance is and what attraction looks like, and that can be identity. So that's actually when I started looking up something called queer affirmative counseling practices, which again someone has spoken about. And I was only able to find at the time 2 places that did it, which was the Karma Center in New Delhi and there was Mariwala Health in Mumbai. Now, thankfully, there are more and more places doing these courses and therapists who have been certified under QACP. But it's still difficult because for a lot of queer people, accessing counseling is difficult. First of all, financially, and second of all, it's so rare to find not queer friendly, but queer affirmative. And like, I honestly feel like during this panel, it's the first time I've seen so many like affirmative therapists. And that's just like making me so happy right now. But at the same time, I do not have access to one. And I'll tell you why this was such a huge problem for me. It was a problem in diagnosis. So currently, I mean, I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and one of the symptoms, one of the aspects of that is this thing called hypomania, where you kind of, I mean, one of the therapists I know can explain that in detail, but it's just sort of like a heightened energy level, and you tend to do some questionable things. That's all I'm going to say. And one of those markers or identifiers is like some very dangerous sexual practices. And for someone like me, that does not apply. So perhaps you would not even be able to diagnose me as someone with bipolar, because you're going according to a very heterosexual, allosexual framework of diagnosis. So that, that makes it very difficult to even express what I'm going through, because I feel like, that, well, what exactly do I say? So I just wanted to bring up again what someone had asked Hena about having a therapist from the same cultural background. And I think it does help, particularly when you're queer, because there are just, like Hena said, that there are sometimes expectations of towing a line when you're talking about a cultural community. But for a queer person, the queer community, it functions slightly differently. So there's scope of, not really having to explain to your therapist how certain dynamics work, but them already understanding. And that can just be so beneficial to, anybody who has been in my position. So yeah, those are my 2 bits.
Thank you so much, Shambhavi. I think that was very, very well explained. And thanks for the insights. I think the next questions would be to Professor Amita Dhanda. The first part of the question would be, how do you view the relationship between prejudice and mental health? What are the biggest mistakes that people within organizations might make in serving clients with disability? The next thing would be, the disability rights movement has devised some pro-inclusion strategies that host possibilities to promote mental health of all. Can you shed some light on this?
All right. Thank you so much, Lasya. And I must sort of also thank you for the fact that you've allowed me to come last, primarily because I suppose I'm the one panelist or one member on this panel who could be kind of representing, say, the policy law spectrum, the kind of people who are in some way responsible for the very excluding structures to which other people are on the receiving end. And most of the time, these kind of structures get created because they are created by, sometimes well-meaning, but very often just people who believe they are all-knowing, and hence do not have to listen to anything else, but just need to be sort of going around organizing both policy and law without understanding the kind of diversity that you are encountering on an all-the-time basis. And I somewhere sort of felt that as the law policy person, if I went early or went first, 1, I don't listen again. And 2, you tend to, whatever you may know at a certain point of time, you tend to believe that that is all there is to know. So I really, really wish to sort of thank every single one of the panelists who've gone before, and to say it's been such a rewarding evening to be hearing so many things from, like very, very different perspectives. And if you need to understand diversity, first of all, you have to engage and encounter it. You have to sort of listen, which is a very critical part of. The other thing which I wanted to also respond to, I'm not doing your questions exactly as you've asked them, Lasya, but I do think I'm answering at the core of what you're asking me. Because to say that, and I'm sort of calling this prejudice, but it's also got a lot to do with the sort of very exclusive way in which we operate, where you believe that you or your own other world. So what doesn't come within your vision is evidently sidelined and excluded. And we create structures or we create the way in which our society gets organized depending upon what people who are in positions of authority can see, or what they see is within their vision. Everything else is kind of excluded. And reason I am sort of making this point is because every one of the panelists in one way or the other did refer to the fact that you can't address these issues as individual issues. They are community questions. They are questions in relation to structure. And if you are not going to be sort of accepting and acknowledging the fact that you have created an excluding structure, and you try to make that you're going to address the mental health issues of this or that community or this or that identity, what you are somewhere doing is that you are not acknowledging that what your own part is in creating those mental health issues. What your own part is in why you are getting somebody not to belong. And I think that's so very integral to any conversation we have, that you firstly recognize, okay, if this is your range of diversity, and if you have created your policy without acknowledging that diversity, you're necessarily going to exclude. In fact, exclusion is a part of your design. And a large part of that design comes in from ignorance which is coming in from prejudice, because you believe that only the people with whom you hang out, who are your community, are the people. See, I mean, amongst the things when we had this lockdown, just as giving one example, it's like it is, upper class, middle class people creating a lockdown, believing everybody has home and everybody has food and you don't really need any of these other things. And so suddenly when you go and tell people that, listen, stay at home, but my workplace is my home and my workplace you have locked down. And you haven't anticipated what you're going to do for me. It's only when people start coming out, and necessarily these are all the invisible players, people who are doing things, but you don't see them. They're supposed to be in the background. You benefit from them. So you have every single person now, like at least a lot of my women friends and other people who are at home, as to how much housework is kind of wearing you down, because suddenly you have to do it. But when it was being done, you didn't really, recognize it in full, that all right, if this person is not going to come, what is going to be happening? So this is my first part for that whole business of prejudice and exclusion, and how much of that is to do with whoever is my community. And I don't see caste, because my caste is the caste which is the dictating caste. If it wasn't the dictating caste, I would see caste, because I am not on the receiving end of that exclusion. My sexual orientation, my disability, none of these things are, or the fact that I am not living in a conflict-ridden zone. Every one of the presentations which came, or every one of the questions that you were addressing and the people we had on the panel, each one was bringing that to us. So on the second part, and I'm not saying that disability has some great panacea, but I am only putting one thing as a counterpoint to how policy is in a majoritarian basis generally made, that disability, or let's say the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, or the slogan that sort of revolves around people with disabilities, nothing about us without us. So you are putting forth that you cannot make disability law policy without involving people with disabilities. I am not, I want to make it clear, Lasya, that I am not saying that there is not exclusiveness or exclusion within disability. There is a certain kind of a hierarchy which subsists there also. So the more visible kind of disabilities, you're blind, you're, like you have an orthopedic thing, these are the kind of disabilities everybody understands. The more invisible disabilities, you have to work towards getting people to comprehend. But this insistence on the whole question of participation, that's one of the ways in which disability human rights has got constructed, with all its faults and failings. As a perspective, it has something that we can draw from. The other thing which I would sort of want to highlight is this insistence on what we call as universal access, that you try as far as be it norms, be it build structures, be it, your access to the internet, you name it. Each one of them needs to be made or put together, acknowledging this diversity. And you celebrate diversity in disability rights, so you're constantly asking for, if more and more people self-identify and say, this is the kind of accommodation, or this is the word or variation I would want, only then can you talk about universal access. Then that's a second thing that you get from disability rights. The third is that they have, because you have to encounter so much of diversity within a community, that they've come up with this whole principle of reasonable accommodation, where you will say that, okay, we try to make it as universal as possible, but someone may still get left out. And if that happens, then you try to tweak your rules, you tweak your structures, you do other things, but the end goal has to be inclusion. So I would sort of, considering I'm coming in the end, it has been a very, very enriching experience for me, but I just wanted to sort of make these two things, that recognize the fact that if your structures and your meta discourse is coming from a very, very limited understanding, because your exposure is very limited, then necessarily it's going to be excluding people. And look at a model which is at least in some ways engaging with things to try to include. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a great roundup, I think, more than anything else. And it was very valuable, all the insights. Actually, quickly, I would like to take one question that came in for Astha, because I think Astha has to leave. So Astha, do you have a minute to answer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the question would be, it's from someone anonymous. It said, with respect to the social safety aspect of the LGBTQIA plus individuals, how should therapists address discrimination by the family of the individual? When should the family be involved? What are some appropriate steps to be taken in this regard? And what are some of the things to be kept in mind while addressing the familial aspect here?
Right. Okay, so managing the family and including the family in this, in this scenario is a bit tricky, because it depends a lot on what are the attitudes and the belief systems that the family is holding. So one of the things, and I think a lot of people have spoken about this earlier also, and I've said this before, that creating a social network for the client, for the person who's seeking help, is most important. The safety network, may not necessarily be just your family. You need to feel safe and secure also in order to be able to engage with your family. Now, also there's another thing, and very more often than not, I have these discussions with a lot of my clients who are dealing with such situations, that the family, like how we hold our identities close to who we are, and we want to demonstrate our identities as as who we are. Our families too have their own held identities. They might be conditional, they might be restricted, they might be biased, but they are what they are. So acceptance of that is extremely important, and it is also important to build on a safety system, social safety system for your own self outside of the family if required. And when it finally comes to including the family in a therapeutic engagement, as a part of an intervention, or as a part of bringing them, including them in the therapeutic process, it is a very gradual process. You need to understand the dynamics of what is going on within the family. Also, it's important to address and recognize what the different family members are saying, what are their belief systems. Try and talk to them as much as you can. The first step would be to make them aware, to help them understand, help break biases, which is not an easy task. And and start, I mean, that's the starting point. And then from there, inclusivity, also empathy, regard, all of these things, they develop from there. So I hope I was able to answer that question, because family is extremely tricky, and it depends from one family to the other, and it depends a lot on the dynamics and the social dynamics within the family.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. I hope the attendees' question was answered.
If not, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is Astha Ahluwalia. So
There's one question that said, wouldn't there be any chances of transference on the side of the therapist as well if they are from the same background or identity?
So here's the thing, right? Transference essentially means some form of regard. It's essentially therapeutic alliance, which might be controversial, I think, in some circles. But the point is that if you're looking at it from a psychodynamic, relational aspect, or even like a psychoanalytic aspect from like the works of Klein, transference and so the regard that the patient has for you is what makes the work successful. Similarly, if you look at what Klein talks about in psychoanalytic work, countertransference is also part of what makes the alliance usable, right? Which is what makes therapy for the person who's availing it. So the thing is, this question about same background, if the therapist and the client are from the same background, I think Shambhavi also answered this very accurately in the sense that I didn't address it initially, but depending on what aspect of identity you're talking about, this can be a good thing or a bad thing. It just depends. But also, if you look at it, mainstream therapy in this country has been from non-marginalized castes and communities and backgrounds. Yeah. Both persons who've been able to avail therapy so far, so the person who's been able to avail therapy and the person providing the therapy has usually been from such non-marginalized, non-vulnerable backgrounds. That hasn't affected therapeutic alliance. And the thing is, what is the person who's seeking therapy looking for, right? You can find, and one of my mentors used to say this, that, no matter where you go in the world, the family is the family. The child is the child. There are cultural differences, and this is where cultural competence and cultural humility matters. But also, what is the function of the family to the person, right? When we're talking about developmental trauma, when we talk about collective trauma, what is the role of society? I've already mentioned, like what does it mean to, other panelists also talked about this, right? These issues are based in the sociological perspective. It's easy to use mental health as a way to say that, oh, you're broken. And that's, in my opinion, my honest opinion, I think it's a very outdated mode of looking at mental health issues. Because everyone's got their particular experiences that they're coming with. The question is, how do you make it meaningful? How do you find meaning and purpose out of it? That doesn't necessarily mean saying, oh, it's your problem to fix. Maybe it is society's problem to fix, and our job as therapists are to be supportive as we do that work. And that's a larger role, I think, that community mental health and mental health used for communities can create.
All right, thank you so much for that one, Hena. I think at this stage, I think we should stop taking questions. So I'm just going to address the ones that are there already. I think there's another question for you, Astha, that looks like it's for you, but it says, but anybody on the panel can take it. My question is, a therapist who comes from a conservative background, though they learn a lot, but still have some reservations and thoughts about marginalized communities such as LGBTQ. How can therapists, I think what the person means is how can the therapists since therapists themselves have conditioning that they that they grew up with, like we all do, how do you unlearn your own preconceived notion? I think that's what the question means, more or less.
Yeah, and let's get everyone to sort of chime in. I think everyone will have very interesting perspectives on this.
Yeah, I'll give mine and then we can sort of move on to others. I think it's of course, we all come with our own biases as a person to the therapist as well, right? And it becomes very difficult sometimes to detach that person from who you are. However, in my experience and what I've understood is that keeping oneself aware, keeping oneself engaged with a variety of concerns that are going on, reading about them, educating your own self, and also interacting with a large number of people is really helpful in coming up to speed to it just helps you not to to actually follow that that being non-judgmental aspect that we have, the skill that we are taught and we are which is drilled into us while we are studying and learning how to be a therapist. how to be genuinely empathetic and non-judgmental, and how to keep our biases for our own self. Also, I think time and practice, it plays a great role in this. Having said that, I think it's a therapist's responsibility. If you are unable to do that, please recognize it. Recognize the fact that I am not comfortable with handling certain kind of concerns. I'm unable to let go of my own biases from it, so I won't be able to handle. Like for me personally, I find it extremely difficult to work with geriatric population. I've never worked with geriatric population for a simple reason that I feel that I get very emotionally attached. So I have recognized that, and I've kept myself away from it. I don't dwell into it, and if I get a case like that, I often try and refer to others. So one is to educate yourself, build your awareness, try and understand what the other person is going through. Along with that, if you're not able to, please recognize it and put like a stop to it, and don't take those concerns. You are a therapist is as much of a human being as anyone else is, and you don't have to be an all encompassing therapist, and you should be able to take all sort of concerns or whatever. That's not possible. So know your boundaries and draw them. Try to extend them as much as you can by learning and by sharing and growing, but draw your boundaries. That's my take on it.
Okay, thank you so much. I think there's another similar question that I want to club with this, and maybe the rest of the panel can take it. Maybe this question just adds on to that. It's basically observations and psychoanalytical researches can be very prone to the psychologist's own bias, like their political ideas. So maybe we're just adding on that aspect of political ideas. How do you then remain objective? So maybe we're speaking about both unlearning and political ideas here. Next, whoever wants to go.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
Since it's psychoanalytical. Sorry. So just jumping in right to start with. This is where the usefulness of supervision and training and your own personal work, like in psychoanalytic work, part of the entire, psychoanalytic work is usually that you shouldn't be seeing therapists unless you're seeing your own therapist or you've started your own analysis. Because it is, as Astha said, the recognition that you are human too, and you have your own biases, and you have conditioning that you also probably need to work through. And these are the spaces where you take these things. So that's what supervision is for. That's what continued training is for. And your personal work is also for you to work on the issues that can be triggering, right, in some cases. And then in many cases, it's also supportive. And those kind of spaces are necessary. The other part about this is also when you do research of this sort, you have to acknowledge these things. And that's where these spaces can be very useful.
Can I add something to? Yeah. So my take on this is mental health discourse in itself is a political discourse. It is not a apolitical discourse. We cannot just say it is supposed to be objective. It is highly political, and the relationship of the therapist and the client is heavily laden with power. So that is something which therapists need to understand that, and it comes with a lot of responsibility, and therapists in general need to take that responsibility of learning and unlearning while they are in the entire process, in the entire therapy process, and through different materials and courses if possible. And also the other that I want to add is this entire relationship is important to recognize the wisdom of the client, what the client is saying. It is important to listen to the client and be it is something more than being empathetic, I feel. It is important to it is important to recognize what the client is trying to say and what is the community wisdom, what is the wisdom of the client that the client is trying to bring forth. I kind of do not like the word client. That is why I'm kind of fumbling. The word client is something I do not relate with, but just for a discussion's sake, I'm using the term over here. So this is what I wanted to add. Yeah.
I wanted to
Can I
sort
also
of,
add? Sure.
yeah, I wanted to come in here and also sort of like put on, put on the agenda, so to say, or on discussion, that it's important to somewhere recognize the fact that even when we are speaking in terms of therapy as not just individual but about community, large amount of therapeutic training comes in centering individuals. So the larger political structures within which individuals are sort of situated is not something which is very integrally questioned or challenged. So if you do not make that connection between the singular and the structural, then necessarily the therapist can advertently or inadvertently push you towards the political position that you are questioning and challenging. So when we had, I think one of the panelists spoke that when it comes to a queer identity, to have a queer therapist helps to the extent that at least you do not have to start by giving the basic kind of information to your therapist. And I think this is like when the intervention which came in from the peace psychologist, I think what was very, very integral was that her entire thing is recognizing the larger political structure and is you're engaging from there. And I think that, at least for me, it's very, very important that just as we need to be knowing what an individual experiences, we need to be recognizing that fact that if an individual has been situated in an evidently disadvantaged political structure, for that person to feel dissatisfied and unhappy about that political structure and to be helped to be emancipating that individual from that structure is what would for me be therapy. If the therapist is not doing that, then the therapist becomes the problem, not the person who's helping you out of that problem. And I genuinely think that, and this business of objectivity, I think it's about time we all forgot about it. Its objectivity is more to do with who has the power to say what I am saying is objective. Everybody else is in a subjective space.
Yeah. Could we, the next question is actually maybe something that could be quickly answered. So I'm also sorry, Arpita had to say something. Arpita, could you? Yeah.
Yeah, I sort of wanted to comment on the fact, like what Professor Dhanda right now also said, that, we need to really, when we're looking at questions like prejudices for therapists and, countertransference and concerns like that coming from, a person who might want to contemplate going to a therapist, that in itself shows that how, the whole mental health discourse is sort of, problematic in that space, because, the therapist is becoming a problem then. If a person is feeling so, is worried or is concerned about acceptance, and about being understood, and and also so what I wanted to say was we need to actually look into we need to actually acknowledge the expertise that the person is bringing in, and Astha talked about how reflexivity of a therapist should be there, about their own biases and all of that, but a reflexivity also has to be there in terms of what are the points of connections and what are the points of disconnections that are happening between a therapist and a client. Yeah. There are times when a client has so much more know-how because they are living, their experience is a lived experience. They are living with it day in and day out. And a lot of times with our own training and our own expertise, earlier someone commented about how, it's about fitting the check boxes and adjusting the person. We actually, in that effort, what gets lost is the expertise of the person who's come to you. All that is required is to be highlighted to that person that, you have a know-how. Whether we call it resilience, whether we call it, strength, whatever we might call it, there is an expertise that exists by the virtue of experience, which a lot of structural forces, therapeutics forces are denying to the person. Like, even if you look on the panel, right, we have 6 experts and to people by experience, and they've come a long way, because we're talking about inclusive mental health, and inclusion means voices of people who have expertise by experience as well. But I think one needs to question the entire training, and how much of it is fitting into the context, like Rashi said. Because, and that's why we have to make that decision whether we want to engage with something or not, because it's making us feel incompetent or uncomfortable as a therapist, when itself it might be difficulty of a person as a therapist to engage in that reflexivity, because probably some therapeutic work needs to happen with the therapist as well, and we need to acknowledge.
All right.
I just quickly want to add to the same discourse. Hello.
Yeah, we were actually dangerously out of time. We are running.
So
we only have
just maybe one point. I'll just this is something I learned from Deepa Pawar of Anubhuti last, and this is something which we from Blue Dawn we firmly believe in this. It's like mental health justice. We are working towards mental health justice. It is not just mental health and therapy. This entire mental health discourse should shift from individuals to mental health justice for individuals and for communities. And this is just that's what I just want to add.
Okay, so quickly, maybe just wrapping this up very fast.
Lasya, can I recommend, there are some 4 or 5 questions that are actually quite different. The couple of questions on body dysphoria, which maybe Shambhavi can quickly answer. There's also a question by Mazar, which is on the chat one. I think important one on the mental health for immigrants into India and what can be done there. And then we'll also be dismissing all the questions that came to us after 6:45. So there are 3 questions there which I'm going to dismiss, but the questions will still be with us, and we'll send them to our therapist, the panelists, and in case they want to reply to those, just type an answer, then we can publish this on our social media. But we're just dismissing 3 questions, so want to share that before doing it, so that you don't feel worried if any of you have that question. Yeah?
Or if any of you could just leave your email IDs there, then we could maybe send the answers to you if they come in, if that is possible for the therapist to.
Drop in your questions at contact@belong.net, and then with your question, and then we'll try and see if we can get it.
That could also be done. Neerath, which question did you say should be taken?
There's a couple of questions on dysphoria, which body dysphoria, which Shambhavi can answer. There's a question by Mazar, which is about Mezar, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, is about asylum seekers in India and their mental health, and the question is about how the authorities actually don't support them, and the society does not support them.
I found it. So could I just read it out quickly?
Yeah.
Our Indian LGBT asylum seekers here, our main reasons to flee India is based on social aspect that pressurize and no protection from authorities. I think what is the Indian society, or how do they address or deal with this issue? I think it's more about seeking asylum because of the situation around. If there is anybody who could take that, comfortable taking it from the panel.
One part of it is, of course, that India has not ratified. It is like we have our entire system of giving people refugee status or providing them asylum is a totally ad hoc kind of a thing. We have not ratified the Refugee Convention. We don't so it's like we are not bound. We have not taken that line that we are bound by law to provide that support. And because of the fact that the entire thing functions totally on discretion, in the exercise of the discretion, the kind of biases which exist for any excluded community necessarily get practiced on when people who are from the LGBTQIA community, if they are trying to seek asylum, because there is no obligation by law to provide it, There is no procedure that you establish there. The entire thing functions on discretion, and then the discretion gets exercised according to the prejudices which subsist within a dominant community.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Professor. I think the last question we're going to discuss is Mehek's question to Shambhavi. Shambhavi, if you could just unmute your audio. The rest of the questions, I think we have a couple of questions from Sunil, which are probably aimed at Professor Dhanda. Sunil, if you could just send them on contact@belong.net. We will try if Professor can answer them later. Mehek's question for you, Shambhavi, is I for a queer myself appreciate your enthusiastic initiatives. Few of my friends, including me, have grown a body dysphoria and distance myself from myself, is how they put it. Could you please suggest me some ways to overcome body dysphoria?
Okay, Mehek, this is a bit of a difficult question for me as I have not lived with body dysphoria. Though I would prefer some clarity on this because I'm wondering if you're talking about gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia. They're slightly different things. They do overlap a little bit. But if I were to try and answer this in two parts really quickly, gender dysphoria is, I mean, that's something that working with a therapist will really help. I think that's one of the best ways to, I mean, I couldn't use the word overcome, but I think to be able to deal with that and lessen the anxiety that comes with it. Body dysmorphia, and again, I mean, please correct me with the terminologies if I'm wrong, but I completely understand body dysmorphia. I think to some extent a lot of us go through it, and particularly during the lockdown, it must be difficult because you're just not able to get into a routine where you sort of do get to acquire the body that makes you feel more comfortable. So I mean, I'm only touching upon it. I do think that it's worth exploring with a therapist. I've also noticed that Sanjana would like to answer this question live. So I mean, I think, yeah, Sanjana, if you can take this, that would be great.
Sanjana, do you have something to say? I think, no, I don't know what exactly happened, but if there is anybody else with a little more perspective on that, one last sentence, maybe Christy, do you want to say something?
I personally do not know. Like, this is something even I'm personally grappling with. Uh, just a few weeks back, I was just like kind of wondering, okay, should I be speaking on trans issues? Because again, because I am not going to go through any surgery. My health condition does not allow that. So then am I a legitimate, quote unquote, legitimate voice for trans community then? Should I be speaking on it at all? But at the same time, it's again like mine. The thing that I'm talking about is specifically gender dysphoria, and uh, and it is not. It is the problem again. The way I see it is not in me. It is in the structure again. It's how gender is constructed, and that is something we need to understand. Um, uh, when it comes to bodily, I'm sorry for the term, like body dysphoria specifically, I cannot talk much on that because personally I've not experienced, like, it's not like, okay, I actually do not talk about that. So, yeah. But when it comes to gender dysphoria, it is not our personal issue. It is the structure in question, and it takes time. And every individual have their own ways of understanding it, of of coping with it. And therapy does help in this entire situation. So maybe speaking to your therapist or speaking to other people who from queer community might as well help. They can, like, collectively we can look at it. So.
If I could even add, like, really quickly, I was just going through some thoughts after what Christy said. I don't know what your identity, what you identify as, Mehek, but if I may, there are some suggestions that I could give. that I have learned from friends of mine who are trans and who have transitioned to male. There are a bunch of ways to sort of lessen the stress. You can look these up online. There are certain modifications. For example, you can get binders, you can get packers. These might help you align your body with your identity, and like it sort of like relieves some of the stress um if you identify as a woman and you're trying to make your body match that. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can like try some more self-expression. If you're in a safe space where you can try out clothing or makeup or just anything that makes you feel nice, then you should definitely give that a shot. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Thank you so much, Shambhavi. And also, I'd want to thank Rashi because she took a lot of questions and typed the answers out there. So thank you, Rashi. And I think, Neera, I'm really glad that everybody came to the session, to all the panelists and to all the attendees as well. This was extremely rich. And going forward, we want to do this and engage with everybody more. You can actually write to us on contact@belong.net or mentalhealth@belong.net with your questions. We will try to see and get them addressed at a later stage if at people's convenience. And yeah, Belong has started the Mental Health Collective, and I think this was a great start. I don't think anybody could have asked for better, considering the lockdown situation. But thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts to every single person who's been here today and provided this extremely rich, insightful session. And anybody with questions, please. I think we had to drop Sunil, Preeti, Nagpal, and one anonymous question. Please write to mentalhealth@belong.net or contact@belong.net, and we will definitely try to get them answered. Neerath, any last thoughts that you would like to add?
No, I just want to thank all the panelists. Thank you for being here. Very, very rich session. I learned a lot myself. And thank you everyone for attending.